They thought I wouldn't notice. They thought papers shuffled in silence could erase me. But I saw the draft will lying crooked on the dining table, a fresh pen mark cutting my name out like it was never meant to exist. That was the night my pulse changed rhythm, the night I stopped being the quiet daughter who absorbed everything without pushing back. My name is Claire Reynolds. I'm 32. I've always been the one who kept the peace, at work, with friends, even at home when my family's sharp edges clashed. My strength has never been in shouting louder, it's in knowing when silence can cut deeper than noise. That's how I survived growing up in a house where my mother, Eleanor, believed love was conditional, and loyalty was something she could rewrite with a pen if it suited her. That evening I stood in the kitchen, staring at the will she thought I hadn't seen. My grandmother's handwriting, steady, patient, the same loop she taught me when I was a girl, had been replaced by sterile black text and a lawyer's seal. It wasn't the legal draft that shocked me, it was the audacity. My mother was sitting in the living room sipping tea, her slippers on the ottoman like nothing had shifted. But everything had. The air smelled of chamomile and lemon polish. I remember the way my throat tightened as if the house itself knew it was complicit. I leaned against the counter, cold stone pressing into my back, and tried to breathe evenly. My grandmother, Margaret, had told me once, don't measure a person by what they promise you. Measure them by what they try to take from you when they think no one's watching. At that moment, I understood what she meant. I had always been closer to my grandmother than to my mother. Margaret raised me in quiet ways, afternoons in her garden, mornings baking bread when the house was still asleep. She believed in fairness, in small rituals of honesty. When she passed, she left me something greater than money, the sense that I was seen, that I mattered. She told me in her final weeks that she wanted me to inherit her house, her journals, even her jewelry. Because you'll protect them, Claire, she whispered, her hand trembling in mine. You'll keep the story of this family alive without twisting it. But now, the draft I had glimpsed told a different story. My mother had moved to erase those words, to redirect everything toward herself and my brother, Paul, who never lifted a finger for Margaret yet always felt entitled to her things. Paul was the kind who saw every gift as a debt you owed him double later. He hadn't even shown up at the hospital until the last day. Still, his name sat firmly in the center of that document, while mine had been reduced to a line break. I didn't confront them that night. Instead, I folded the paper neatly, placed it back where I found it, and poured myself a glass of water. The glass trembled in my hand, but I forced myself to drink slowly. If I spoke too soon, they'd spin it against me. If I showed rage, they'd paint me as ungrateful. I knew my mother's game. This was going to be a long one, and I'd need more than anger to win it. The days that followed blurred into subtle tensions. My mother began speaking of Margaret's estate as if it was already hers, redecorating ideas, plans to sell the property, even comments about which necklace she'd wear for upcoming church events. Paul hovered like a shadow, smirking when I passed by, as if he already knew I was powerless. I played along, smiled politely, and let them believe I was blind. But inside, I was counting steps, watching patterns, waiting for the right opening. One evening I sat alone on my grandmother's porch, the wood creaking under my chair. The air smelled of lilacs, the same bush Margaret planted when I was 10. I closed my eyes and tried to hear her voice again, calm and unwavering. Don't fight with noise, Claire. Fight with proof. Those words had stayed with me since I was a teenager. Now they carried a new weight. I realized this wasn't just about money or property. It was about erasure. If I let them succeed, it would mean Margaret's trust in me had been for nothing. It would mean silence won. And silence, in this case, wasn't strength, it was surrender. My phone buzzed in my pocket. It was a message from a friend I hadn't spoken to in months, a lawyer named Julia who had always been blunt in ways I admired. I stared at the screen, thumb hovering, the decision already forming in my chest. Maybe this was the moment Margaret had been preparing me for all along. I typed back, we need to talk. It's about my grandmother's will. And as I pressed send, I knew there was no turning back. The next morning, I found my mother at the dining table again, pen in hand, speaking softly to Paul about sealing everything up quickly. She looked up at me with a calm smile, the kind that pretends nothing is wrong. But I felt something shift inside me. For the first time, I wasn't afraid of her smile. I was ready to answer it. I set my coffee cup down harder than I meant to. The sound echoed across the table, and for a flicker of a second, her smile froze. She knew I had heard. What she didn't know was that I had already started planning. And that's where things began to unravel. The truth never arrives with thunder. It seeps in, like water under a locked door, until the floor beneath you quietly shifts. That was the sensation in my chest as I sat across from my mother and brother, their whispers floating between them while they pretended I wasn't there. I carried my coffee back to the porch, gripping the handle harder than necessary, and let the morning air wrap around me. The smell of damp wood and lilacs made me think of Margaret again, my grandmother, the anchor of my life. Her presence still lived in those details. She had been steady where my mother was sharp, warm where Paul was dismissive. Sitting on that porch, I remembered how she used to tuck letters into the pocket of my jacket, each one small but deliberate, reminders to trust myself, reminders that the truth has weight even when people try to bury it. Margaret believed in fairness, almost to a fault. When I was 16 and Paul had wrecked his car after a night out, my mother tried to hush it away. Margaret insisted we face it as a family. She made Paul apologize in front of all of us and pay for the repairs himself. It wasn't about punishment, it was about responsibility. If you don't own your choices, she told us, your choices will own you. I never forgot the way Paul's face twisted in resentment, or the way my mother glared at her own mother like she had committed some unspeakable crime by holding him accountable. I grew up between those worlds, one that demanded accountability and one that thrived on manipulation. It taught me a kind of dual vision. I learned to smile when my mother demanded it, but to keep my grandmother's words buried close, like seeds waiting for their season. That dual vision returned now, sharper than ever. Every glance my mother gave me across the table was a test, every half-sentence Paul dropped was bait. I pretended to be neutral, but my thoughts kept circling Margaret's journals. She used to write in them daily, her tidy handwriting recording the quiet rhythm of her life, who she spoke to, what was planted in the garden, even who visited and what was said. I realized, with a jolt, that those journals might hold more than memories. They might hold proof. Proof of what Margaret wanted. Proof of how she had seen me, not as the shadow daughter my mother tried to paint, but as the one she trusted most. That night I pulled the old wooden box from under the bed where I had stored Margaret's things. The journal still smelled faintly of lavender, the sachet she always kept between the pages. My hands trembled as I opened one at random. Her words were steady even in her final months, like her hand had refused to betray her. On one page, written less than 2 weeks before she passed, I found it, I told Claire what is hers. She understands, and she will keep it safe. Eleanor and Paul won't like it, but that is not my concern. My concern is fairness. I read that line again and again, until the ink blurred. It wasn't a legal clause, but it was her voice. It was the truth she wanted recorded. And I knew in my gut that my mother would have no interest in preserving these journals. She would burn them if she realized what was inside. That was the moment the grief inside me transformed. Up until then, I had been mourning Margaret's absence. But now, I was protecting her presence. That shift steadied me. It wasn't about fighting my mother. It was about defending the woman who had defended me my whole life. Days turned into weeks, and the pressure only grew. My mother began dropping comments in front of relatives about streamlining the estate, as if it was already settled. Paul grew bolder, talking about selling the house, even making calls from the front porch about potential buyers. I stayed quiet, watching, collecting small details. Every note they scribbled, every careless word they let slip, I filed away. The isolation crept in heavier. Friends asked me why I was distant, why I never joined dinners or outings anymore. I didn't know how to tell them that the betrayal of blood weighs differently than any other. It isn't loud, it's a quiet corrosion, and you can't shake it off like a bad day. The only person I let in was Julia, my old friend, the lawyer. When I told her about the draft will, she didn't gasp or rage. She just nodded and said, "You'll need more than suspicion. Start gathering." Her words grounded me. I started scanning Margaret's journals, page by page, storing digital copies in a folder I named with nothing but numbers. I also took pictures of small objects, Margaret's letters, cards, even the photographs with her notes scribbled on the back. They weren't legal documents, but they were threads of truth, and I knew if I pulled enough of them together, a pattern would form that even my mother couldn't deny. Still, at night, the weight pressed harder. I lay awake listening to the creak of the house, every sound sharp in the dark. I wondered if I was strong enough for what was coming. But then I'd remember Margaret's steady hand guiding mine as I wrote my name in careful cursive, her voice saying, "Proof, Claire. Proof outlives lies." And I clung to that. One evening, Paul cornered me in the hallway. His tone was casual, but his eyes were sharp. He said, "You're not planning to cause trouble, are you?" I replied, "Trouble has a way of finding itself." He smirked, but I caught the flicker of unease in his eyes before he turned away. That was enough for me. They were watching me, just as I was watching them. The balance had shifted. I closed the journal I'd been reading later that night, slid it back into the box, and locked it away. But even as I turned the key, I knew the journals alone weren't enough. I needed something more concrete, something that could stand in a room where lies were dressed as truth. And then the thought struck me, there was one thing my mother and brother hadn't considered. One witness they couldn't control. The realization left me sitting in the dark, heart racing, because once I reached out, there would be no pulling back. Fear doesn't always arrive as panic. Sometimes it's just a thud in your chest when you realize you've crossed a line you can't uncross. I sat in the dark long after the idea came to me, who I needed to call, who had been there when Margaret still had breath in her lungs and clarity in her mind. There was one person she'd trusted completely, who had no stake in our family games, Mrs. Faye Connolly. Her next-door neighbor, friend of 30 years, the woman who used to leave casseroles on our porch when things were tense inside. I hadn't spoken to her in months. After the funeral, the house fell quiet and people drifted back to their own routines. But now, her name was the only one that felt clean in my mind. I waited until morning, then walked to her door, palms cold despite the rising heat. She opened it wearing the same navy cardigan she'd worn to the service. Her face softened when she saw me. She said, "Claire, honey, you all right?" I replied, "Do you remember what Margaret told you before she passed?" I hadn't meant to ask it that directly. But something about her voice, gentle, unpolished, made the question fall out of me. She invited me in without hesitation. Her kitchen smelled like sugar cookies, the way it always did, and I had to blink quickly to stop myself from slipping backward into easier times. Mrs. Connolly didn't have documents. But she had dates, exact conversations. She spoke plainly, how Margaret had told her, more than once, that I was to have the house. That she wanted me to live in it, keep it in the family without turning it into a sale item. She was proud of you, Claire, she said. Said you were the only one who listened without trying to rewrite her. I asked if she would say that in front of someone. Maybe a lawyer. She didn't flinch. She said, "I've known liars. Margaret wasn't one of them." When I walked home, the sun had started cutting through the trees, and everything looked too bright. I didn't feel victorious. I felt hollowed out. Like every step I took toward the truth came at the cost of something I couldn't name. Inside, Paul was on the phone again, talking loudly in the kitchen. His voice bounced off the walls like it owned them. I stayed in the hallway, listening. He was discussing timelines, the sale, a new appraisal. My stomach twisted. He was moving fast. Too fast. That night, I wrote everything down, my conversation with Mrs. Connolly, her phrasing, the exact words she used. I emailed Julia, told her I might have a witness, and attached a few of Margaret's scanned pages for context. I didn't dramatize. I just laid it out the way Margaret would have wanted, plain, factual, steady. Julia called instead of replying. She said, "That journal entry. It might not be legal proof, but it's persuasive." I asked, "Enough?" She said, "It's a beginning. But we'll need to be precise, Claire. Clean. No emotional mud." She was right. I couldn't flinch. Still, the weight of it stayed with me. The house began to feel thinner, like a stage set about to collapse. My mother watched me more closely, offering smiles that didn't reach her eyes. She began making veiled comments about how some people cling to things that were never promised. I didn't respond. I just documented every word. Then the call started. Distant relatives, some I hadn't spoken to in years, began reaching out. Curious. Concerned. Oddly phrased messages that felt rehearsed. One cousin said, "I'm sure you know it's all being handled fairly." I replied, "That depends how you define fair." It was clear my mother was spreading her version before I had a chance to speak. She wanted to frame the story, cast me as ungrateful or emotional. It was a subtle smear campaign, but I recognized the playbook. What I hadn't anticipated was how lonely it would feel, even with the truth on my side. At night, I found myself staring at the ceiling, trying to remember Margaret's voice clearly. Not just the words she used, but the cadence. The steadiness. It grounded me more than anything else. And then something shifted. Paul began pushing harder, asking to see certain documents, dropping phrases like "we're just trying to wrap things up." It was clear he suspected I was preparing something, but he couldn't prove it. Yet. Julia suggested we request a hold through probate court, something subtle, temporary, but enough to pause any transfer or sale. Just to give us time to breathe, she said. It would be quiet, invisible to the others until it was already in place. I said yes. But I knew it would trigger a response. My mother didn't like silence unless she controlled it. Sure enough, 3 days later, she appeared in my room unannounced. Her knock came as the door was already opening. She stood in the doorway holding an envelope. She said, "I thought we were done with secrets, Claire." Her voice was gentle, but her eyes were calculating. I took the envelope, knowing better than to react too quickly. Inside was a letter, typed and signed, from their lawyer. A formal notice of estate proceedings moving forward. A timeline. A veiled threat. I nodded, folded the paper slowly, and placed it on my desk. I replied, "I'm not the one hiding things." She held my gaze longer than usual. Then she smiled, just slightly, and walked out. That night, I opened a new folder on my computer and titled it Final Layer. It would hold everything else, witness names, timestamped screenshots, even a few recordings. I hated the idea of recording anyone. But Julia had said it cleanly, truth needs teeth. As I uploaded the files, I saw a reflection of myself in the screen, shoulders hunched, jaw tight, eyes colder than I remembered. I hadn't noticed how much this was changing me. And still, the hardest part was knowing that the real confrontation hadn't even begun. Some lies you learn to live around, like cracks in the ceiling you stop noticing. But some lies demand confrontation, if only so you can breathe again. After I created the Final Layer folder, everything around me began to feel temporary. Like the walls were just waiting to echo. The house didn't feel like mine, not yet, but it didn't feel like theirs anymore either. That shift in ownership wasn't legal, it was psychological. A quiet, slow erosion of control. And they could feel it. Paul no longer lingered in the hallways. My mother stopped making small talk in the kitchen. The air between us had turned to glass, clear, fragile, and cold. Every movement was careful now. Every word tested for weight. I adjusted my schedule. I rose early and walked Margaret's old garden path with her journals in my bag, making notes, taking photos, creating a timeline Julia could use. It was tedious work, but it grounded me. Not because I needed to win. Because I needed to prove. The confrontation wasn't going to be one scene. It was going to be a slow, methodical exposure, like lifting a rug inch by inch and showing the rot beneath. Julia helped me prepare without emotion. She wasn't interested in family drama. She wanted clean entries, documented inconsistencies, legal leverage. She said, "We can challenge the will on grounds of undue influence. Not just sentiment. We need patterns." I replied, "I've got patterns." We started tracing Margaret's medical history. Toward the end, her health had declined, but her mental clarity, until the very last weeks, was intact. There were notes in her journal about conversations, decisions, preferences. The entry where she'd written, "Paul asked again. I told him no. Claire understands my reasons." That alone was a lifeline. But it wasn't just about proving what Margaret wanted. It was about disproving what they had tried to reconstruct. I spent nights reviewing the previous drafts of the will. One of Julia's contacts had helped pull metadata from the scanned PDFs. There were version edits that coincided exactly with the days Paul had driven Margaret to appointments, days when I wasn't told she'd needed help. Days when I later learned she'd come home unusually tired. It chilled me. I began tracking receipts, calendars, old texts. I created a spreadsheet Julia could work from. I labeled every piece of the puzzle with simple codes, M1 for journal entries, E1 for email screenshots, W1 for witness statements. I didn't want anything left to interpretation. In the middle of all this, I started sleeping in Margaret's old room. Not out of sentiment, but out of necessity. The lock worked. It was the only door in the house that hadn't been changed since she passed. That was when I found the key. It was buried in the lining of a drawer, taped beneath a stack of receipts from years ago. A small brass key with the initials MR etched faintly near the base. I didn't recognize it immediately. But something in me snapped awake. I pulled out the wooden chest from her closet, the one that had always been locked. No one had ever asked what was inside. Not even Paul, who once pried open a locked cabinet just to steal a birthday bottle of wine. The key fit. Inside were envelopes. 6 of them. All addressed in Margaret's handwriting. Each one sealed, each one dated. One was addressed to me. One to Eleanor, my mother. One to Paul. One to Mrs. Connolly. One to Julia. And one to no name at all, just the words, "to be read if contested." I didn't open mine. Not yet. I took the envelope for Julia and drove it to her office without warning. When she opened the flap and read, she didn't speak for a full minute. She said, "Claire, this changes things." Inside, Margaret had handwritten her intentions, each decision, each item, each reason. It wasn't a legal document, not notarized, but it was damning in its clarity. She named the pressure she'd felt. She named the conversations. She named the manipulation. That night, I opened my own envelope. Margaret's voice was so familiar it felt like she was sitting beside me. "Claire, if you're reading this, then things did not unfold peacefully. I am sorry for that. I hope you are choosing truth, not revenge. I know you will. You always saw the whole of things. Please do what must be done, not out of bitterness, but so that the story stays honest." It wrecked me. I didn't cry. I didn't throw anything. I just sat there, unmoving, her words running over me like water. I slept a few hours. When I woke, I began preparing the confrontation. It wasn't going to be a screaming match. No raised voices, no slammed doors. It would be a dinner, just like the ones Margaret used to host. I sent the invitations quietly, one to my mother, one to Paul, and one to Mrs. Connolly. I told Julia to come as well, but to stay quiet until I gave a signal. The date was set for Sunday. I cooked Margaret's recipes. Roasted vegetables, baked fish with thyme, lemon pie. I set the table with her dishes, laid out the cloth she only used at Christmas. I wanted them to feel her presence. I wanted them to see what they were about to erase. Paul arrived first, smelling of cologne and overconfidence. My mother followed, dressed in soft blues, carrying her fake warmth like a shawl. Mrs. Connolly came in last, quiet and composed. We sat. We ate. They made small talk. I let them. Then I placed the final envelope in the center of the table. I said, "Margaret left us something. I thought it should be read aloud." My mother's hand hovered. Paul narrowed his eyes. I didn't blink. Julia, sitting silently in the corner, unfolded the letter and began to read. The sound of forks setting down on porcelain was louder than anything else. And for the first time I watched their faces change. Not from shock. From exposure. I didn't move. I just breathed. Because the quiet part was almost over. Some silences feel heavier than words. That night at the table, silence carried the weight of betrayal exposed, a truth too sharp to swallow. Julia's voice didn't falter as she read Margaret's handwriting, steady and clear. Every line cut through the room, stripping away the veneer my mother and Paul had polished for weeks. Margaret had laid everything out, her fears of being pressured, her deliberate choice to leave the house to me, her certainty that I would preserve what mattered. She hadn't left room for interpretation. When Julia finished, she folded the letter gently and placed it back on the tablecloth. The ticking of the clock on the wall seemed impossibly loud. No one reached for their glasses. No one breathed too deeply. It was as if Margaret herself had returned to sit with us, forcing her daughter and grandson to face her honesty one last time. Paul broke first. He said, "This doesn't prove anything. It's not legal." His voice was clipped, but I saw the sweat at his temples, the way his jaw tightened like he was holding back more than anger. I looked at him, calm. I replied, "It proves intent. It proves she knew what was happening." My mother stayed quiet longer, her fork resting neatly beside her plate, her lips pressed in a thin line. When she finally spoke, her words were soft, but they carried that same old blade. She said, "Your grandmother loved us all. She would never want division." The irony of it nearly made me laugh. Margaret's letter was proof that division had already been forced, not by me, but by them. I didn't answer. Instead, I slid the journal across the table, open to the page where Margaret had written about Paul asking and her saying no. The room shifted. Mrs. Connolly cleared her throat gently, her presence quiet but undeniable. She had been named in one of the letters too, her loyalty to Margaret shining through. And now she was here, a witness in flesh, not just in ink. Paul leaned back in his chair, eyes darting to my mother as if waiting for her to deliver the script. But for once, she had none. She looked tired, older, her control slipping like sand through her fingers. Dinner ended without dessert. They left without raising their voices, but the silence that followed them out the door was more dangerous than any argument could have been. It wasn't over. It was only repositioning. After they left, Julia stayed behind. She closed her briefcase slowly, giving me a look I had never seen from her, half warning, half respect. She said, "They won't accept this quietly. Be ready." I nodded, though readiness felt like a hollow word. I was preparing for a battle I hadn't asked for, a war waged in paperwork and whispers instead of open fields. And yet, I couldn't step back. In the days that followed, the calls came again. My mother rang relatives, framing me as manipulative, insisting Margaret had been confused, frail, easily swayed. Paul showed up at the house unannounced, pacing the driveway, making sure I saw him talking to neighbors. A performance, carefully staged. But I had already shifted. Their noise didn't rattle me the way it once had. Every time I felt doubt creeping in, I opened Margaret's letter. I read her words until the calm returned. She hadn't asked me to fight out of bitterness. She had asked me to keep the story honest. So I fought with documents, not accusations. I filed motions through probate with Julia. I attached the scanned journals, the witness statements, the envelope addressed to be read if contested. Each piece was quiet, methodical, unshakable. One evening, Paul cornered me in the driveway. He said, "You're tearing this family apart." I replied, "No. I'm showing what was already broken." His face twisted, but he didn't push further. He couldn't, not with neighbors within earshot. He drove away fast, tires spitting gravel, the performance crumbling at the edges. That night I sat alone at the dining table, the same table where the confrontation had unfolded. I stared at the empty plate still stacked in the corner, the cloth folded neatly away, and I felt something I hadn't in weeks: steadiness. Not relief, not triumph. Just the firm ground beneath me returning. But steadiness didn't last long. A letter arrived the following morning. This time not from their lawyer, but from mine. Inside was a notice: Paul and Eleanor had filed a formal objection, claiming undue influence, against me. They were turning the accusation back, twisting Margaret's love into evidence against me. I read it twice, 3 times. My hands didn't shake. My pulse didn't spike. I just folded it carefully, placed it on the table, and stared at the space where Margaret's letter had rested days earlier. They were willing to burn everything, even her memory, to win. And I realized, with an ache deep in my chest, that the next confrontation wouldn't happen at a dinner table. It would happen under oath. Betrayal tastes different when it's written on legal paper. It isn't rage, it's metal on the tongue, a coldness that lingers even when you've swallowed it. The objection they filed against me was neatly typed, stamped, and delivered without hesitation, as if erasing me could be done in a few paragraphs. Reading it felt like standing in a room where the air was being pulled out slowly. They claimed I had manipulated Margaret, that I'd isolated her, coerced her into favoring me. The words were sharp, deliberate, designed not just to fight me, but to stain me. Julia read it in silence. When she finally looked up, her expression was calm but grave. She said, "We expected this. Now it's about evidence, not emotion." Her words steadied me, but only for a moment. Because I knew what my mother was capable of when backed into a corner. She didn't care about truth. She cared about winning, and she'd taught Paul the same creed. I spent the following days sorting documents into binders. Dates, journals, receipts, witness statements, every sheet labeled, tabbed, indexed. It was clinical, methodical, almost inhuman. But it gave me control. Each binder felt like armor, proof that I wasn't just holding on by memory or sentiment. Nights were harder. I sat in Margaret's old room, the letter she'd left me folded under my pillow. Her words pressed against me as I tried to sleep: "Do what must be done, not out of bitterness, but so the story stays honest." I whispered them aloud sometimes, steadying my breath in the dark. When the first hearing date arrived, I dressed simply. Dark blazer, no jewelry except the silver bracelet Margaret had given me on my 21st birthday. Paul wore a sharp suit, expensive and loud in its precision. My mother sat beside him in pale gray, her expression soft and mournful, like she was the victim in all of this. I didn't speak much. Julia handled the opening remarks. She laid out the journals, the letters, the witness statements. Every piece was placed before the court without flourish, only clarity. Then came their turn. Their lawyer painted me as manipulative, opportunistic, a granddaughter who took advantage of an old woman's fading strength. They spoke of sudden closeness, of uncharacteristic decisions, of influence exerted behind closed doors. Each phrase was calculated to wound. I didn't flinch. I kept my eyes on the judge, not on them. But inside, I felt the edges of myself tightening, hardening into something I hadn't known before. Mrs. Connolly testified. She spoke quietly but firmly, recounting Margaret's words in the weeks before she died. She told the court how Margaret had spoken of me, of trust, of fairness. Her voice never shook. Watching her stand there, unwavering, I felt the first flicker of something like hope. Paul's testimony was next. He sat forward, hands clasped tightly, his voice smooth but rehearsed. He said, "She kept things from us. She isolated Grandma. She made us believe she was frail and confused when really it was her pulling strings. His eyes flicked to me briefly, daring me to break. I didn't. Julia cross-examined him, pressing on the inconsistencies. His timeline faltered. He contradicted himself twice. A small crack, but enough. My mother's testimony cut deeper. She spoke with precision, weaving guilt into every word. She said, "My daughter never wanted to share. She always felt overlooked, and she used that against her own grandmother. Margaret loved us equally. I know that in my heart." Her voice quivered, but her eyes were steel. It was a performance she had mastered long before this. When it ended, I walked out of the courtroom into the sunlight, my chest tight. Julia touched my arm briefly. She said, "This isn't decided in one day." But you held. The days that followed blurred with filings, motions, witness lists. Each step was heavier than the last, but I moved through them steadily. I no longer cared about their smear campaign. Neighbors whispered, relatives avoided me, but none of it mattered. What mattered was Margaret's voice, written and witnessed, surviving their attempts to erase it. Then came the notice. A new hearing date, this time with financial evaluators. They were pushing for the sale of the house, claiming it was the only fair division. If the judge agreed, everything Margaret had wanted would be reduced to numbers on paper, and the house would slip from me forever. That night, I walked through every room, touching the walls, the doorframes, the worn banister Margaret used to steady herself. It wasn't just a house. It was her legacy, the place where she'd taught me honesty, where she'd shown me how to stand even in silence. Losing it would mean more than money. It would mean surrender. I sat at her old desk, opened my laptop, and began drafting something new. Not legal documents. A letter. To be read aloud, if it came to that. Not bitter, not vengeful, just true. When I finished, I folded it carefully and slipped it into the last envelope in Margaret's chest, the one labeled to be read if contested. Because I understood now. She hadn't written that envelope for herself. She had left it for me. And I would use it when the moment came. The morning of the next hearing, as I reached for my blazer, I noticed an envelope slipped under my door. No postage. Just my name, written in Paul's rushed handwriting. I opened it. Inside was one line, "If you keep pushing this, you'll regret it." The threat wasn't legal. It was personal. And it meant the final stage was coming. Threats don't sound like thunder when they come from family. They sound like paper sliding under a door, quiet enough to be missed if you're not listening. I sat with Paul's note in my hand, reading the single sentence again and again. "If you keep pushing this, you'll regret it." No signature, no detail, just his rushed handwriting, the same he used to scrawl grocery lists when he lived off Margaret's generosity. But the message was clear, he'd stepped beyond the courtroom. I didn't show fear. Not to Julia, not to Mrs. Connolly, not even to myself. I folded the note and added it to the final layer binder. If he wanted to turn intimidation into strategy, then his words would become evidence too. The morning of the hearing felt heavier than the last. I dressed as I had before, dark blazer, simple hair, the silver bracelet on my wrist. When I arrived, Paul was already there, jaw tight, pacing near the courtroom doors. My mother stood beside him, one hand resting lightly on his arm, her voice low and coaxing, like she was trying to steady a storm. Inside, the judge reviewed the filings. The air was thick with paper, ink, and tension. This session was about division, about whether the house would be sold or preserved. For them, it was about leverage. For me, it was about survival, not of comfort, but of memory, of truth. Julia presented the binders. Every page tabbed, every entry dated, every witness statement clean. She placed Paul's note on the stack without comment, letting its ugliness speak for itself. When it was their turn, their lawyer tried to frame it as a misunderstanding, a family dispute blown out of proportion. But the cracks in their case widened under questioning. Dates didn't line up. Their story shifted. Their certainty slipped. Then the judge asked if there was anything further. Julia glanced at me. I knew the signal. I rose, steady, and handed the final envelope, the one labeled to be read if contested. The court clerk opened it, unfolded Margaret's handwriting, and read aloud. Her words filled the room like a second presence. If this estate is contested, let it be known, my decision was deliberate. I was not coerced. I chose Claire because she understood what the rest refused, that legacy is not to be sold, but kept. If they cannot respect this, then let them live with the shame of their own choices. I write this with clarity, with no pressure, and with full knowledge of what it means. The silence that followed was absolute. Even the judge paused, as if Margaret herself had demanded the space. Paul looked down, fists clenched. My mother's face didn't change, but her eyes betrayed something, a flash of fear, or perhaps recognition that her control had finally slipped beyond reach. The ruling wasn't immediate. Judges rarely give closure in the moment. But as we left, Julia leaned toward me, her voice low. She said, "This letter, it shifts everything. They'll have to retreat." Outside, the air felt lighter, though the fight wasn't finished. Paul avoided my eyes. My mother brushed past me without a word. But their silence was no longer the silence of control. It was the silence of retreat. That evening, I returned to Margaret's house. I walked through each room slowly, touching the furniture, the frames, the familiar worn edges of a home that had never tried to lie to me. The house breathed again. In the kitchen, I set her journals back on the shelf. In the dining room, I unfolded the tablecloth and laid it flat, smoothing the wrinkles with my hands. It wasn't about ownership anymore. It was about carrying forward what she had trusted me to protect. I thought of Paul's note, of my mother's performance, of the way they'd tried to twist Margaret's love into a weapon. And then I thought of Margaret's last words in her letter, "Legacy is not to be sold, but kept." It wasn't victory I felt. It was release. I stepped onto the porch as the sun set, the air cool and sharp. For the first time in months, I breathed without the weight pressing down. But even in that calm, I knew this wasn't an ending. Families don't fracture once, they fracture in echoes. There would be distance, there would be silence, there would be wounds that never closed. Still, Margaret's voice lingered, steady as always. Proof had outlived lies. And as the last light drained from the sky, I understood, I hadn't just kept her house. I had kept her truth. That was the inheritance no one could take.